Welcome to Celtic Tomes, bringing you readings from bygone books.
Welcome to Celtic Tomes, bringing you readings by Gary and Ruth from the classic books of Celtic lore and study. Chapter 19 of For the Religion of the Ancient Celts by J.A. MacCulloch.
Chapter 18 Festivals. The Celtic year was not at first regulated by the solstices and equinoxes, but by some method connected with agriculture or with the seasons. Later, the year was a lunar one, and there is some evidence of attempts at synchronizing solar and lunar time. But time was mainly measured by the moon, while in all calculations, night preceded day. Thus, oidhche was the night preceding Samhain, November the 1st, not the following night. The usage survives in our sennight and fortnight. In early times, the year had 2, possibly 3 divisions, marking periods in pastoral or agricultural life, but it was afterwards divided into 4 periods, while the year began with the winter division, opening at Samhain. A twofold, subdivided into a fourfold division, is found in Irish texts, and may be tabulated as follows. A. Geimredh, winter half, comprising first quarter, Geimredh, beginning with the festival of Samhain, November the 1st, and the second quarter, Earrach, beginning February the 1st, sometimes called Oimelc. B. Saura, summer half, comprising the third quarter, Saura, beginning with the festival of Beltane, May the 1st, called also Cét-soman or Cét-samain, the first day of Samono-s, compare the Welsh Cyntefyn. The fourth quarter, Foghamar, beginning with the festival of Lugnasadh, August the 1st, sometimes called Brontroghain. These divisions began with festivals, and clear traces of 3 of them occur over the whole Celtic area, but the 4th has now been merged in St. Bridget's Day. Beltane and Samhain marked the beginning of the 2 great divisions, and were perhaps at first movable festivals, according as the signs of summer or winter appeared earlier or later. With the adoption of the Roman calendar, some of the festivals were displaced, e.g. in Gaul, where the calends of January took the place of Samhain, the ritual being also transferred. None of the 4 festivals is connected with the times of equinox and solstice. This points to the fact that originally the Celtic year was independent of these, but Midsummer Day was also observed not only by the Celts, but by most European folk, the ritual resembling that of Beltane. It has been held, and an old tradition in Ireland gives support to the theory, that under Christian influences the old pagan feast of Beltane was merged with that of St. John the Baptist on Midsummer Day. But though there are Christian elements in the midsummer ritual, denoting a desire to bring it under church influence, the pagan elements in folk customs are strongly marked, and the festival is deeply rooted in an early paganism all over Europe. Without much acquaintance with astronomy, men must have noted the period of the sun's longest course from earlier times, and it will probably be observed ritually. The festivals of Beltane and Midsummer may have arisen independently and entered into competition with each other, or Beltane may have been an earlier pastoral festival marking the beginning of summer while the herds went out to pasture, and the Midsummer a more purely agricultural festival. And since their ritual aspect and purpose as seen in folk custom are similar, they may eventually have borrowed each from the other, or there may be later separate fixed dates of an earlier movable summer festival. For our purpose, we may here consider them as twin halves of such a festival. Where midsummer was already observed, the influence of the Roman calendar would confirm that observance. The festivals of the Christian year also affected the older observances. Some of the ritual was transferred to saints' days within the range of the pagan festival days. Thus the Samhain ritual is found observed on St. Martin's Day. In other cases, holy days took the place of the old festivals. All Saints and All Souls, that of Samhain, St. Bridget's Day, that of February the 1st, St. John the Baptist's Day, that of Midsummer, Lammas, that of Lugnasadh, and some attempt was made to hallow, if not oust, the older ritual. The Celtic festivals being primarily connected with agricultural and pastoral life, we find in their ritual survivals traces not only of a religious but of a magical view of things, of acts designed to assist the powers of life and growth. The proof of this will be found in a detailed examination of the surviving customs connected with them. Samhain. Samhain, beginning the Celtic year, was an important social and religious occasion. The powers of blight were beginning their ascendancy, yet the future triumph of the powers of growth was not forgotten. Probably Samhain had gathered up into itself other feasts occurring earlier or later. Thus it bears traces of being a harvest festival, the ritual of the earlier harvest feast being transferred to the winter feast, as the Celts found themselves in lands where harvest is not gathered before late autumn. The harvest rites may, however, have been associated with threshing rather than ingathering. Samhain also contains in its ritual some of the old pastoral cults, while as a New Year feast, its ritual is in great part that of all festivals of beginnings. New fire was brought into each house at Samhain from the sacred bonfire, itself probably kindled from the need fire by the friction of pieces of wood. This preserved its purity, the purity necessary to a festival of beginnings. The putting away of the old fires was probably connected with various rites for the expulsion of evils, which usually occur among many peoples at the New Year festival. By that process of dislocation which scattered the Samhain ritual over a wider period and gave some of it to Christmas, the kindling of the Yule Log may have been originally connected with this festival. Divination and forecasting the fate of the inquirer for the coming year also took place. Sometimes these were connected with a bonfire, stones placed in it showing by their appearance the fortune or misfortune awaiting their owners. Others, like those described by Burns in his Halloween, were unconnected with a bonfire and were of an erotic nature. The slaughter of animals for winter consumption which took place at Samhain, or as now at Martinmas, thoroughly connected with economic reasons, had a distinctly religious aspect, as it had among the Teutons. In recent times, in Ireland, one of the animals was offered to St. Martin, who may have taken the place of a god, and ill luck followed the non-observance of the custom. The slaughter was followed by general feasting. This later slaughter may be traced back to the pastoral stage, in which the animals were regarded as divine, and one was slain annually and eaten sacramentally. Or if the slaughter was more general, the animals would be propitiated. But when the animals ceased to be worshipped, the slaughter would certainly be more general, though still preserving traces of its original character. The pastoral sacrament may also have been connected with the slaying and eating of an animal representing the corn spirit at harvest time. In one legend, St. Martin is associated with the animals slain at Martinmas, and is said to have been cut up and eaten in the form of an ox, as if a former divine animal had become an anthropomorphic divinity, the latter being merged in the personality of a Christian saint. Other rites, connected with the calendar of January as a result of dislocation, point also in this direction. In Gaul and Germany, riotous processions took place with men dressed in the heads and skins of animals. This rite is said by Till to have been introduced from Italy, but it's more likely to have been a native custom. As the people ate the flesh of the slain animals sacramentally, so they clothed themselves in the skins to promote further contact with their divinity. Perambulating the township sunwise, dressed in the skin of a cow, took place until recently in the Hebrides at New Year, in order to keep off misfortune. A piece of the hide being burned and the smoke inhaled by each person and animal in the township. Similar customs have been found in other Celtic districts, and these animal disguises can hardly be separated from the sacramental slaughter at Samhain. Evils having been or being about to be cast off in the New Year ritual, a few more added to the number can make little difference. Hence, among primitive peoples, New Year is often characterised by orgiastic rites. These took place at the Calends in Gaul, and were denounced by councils and preachers. In Ireland, the merriment of Samhain is often mentioned in the texts, and similar orgiastic rites lurk behind the Halloween customs in Scotland, and in the licence still permitted to use in the quietest townships of the West Highlands at Samhain Eve. Samhain, as has been seen, was also a festival of the dead, whose ghosts were fed at this time. As the powers of growth were in danger, and in an eclipse in winter, men thought it necessary to assist them. As a magical aid, the Samhain bonfire was chief, and it is still lit in the Highlands. Brands were carried around, and from it the new fire was lit in each house. In North Wales, people jumped through the fire, and when it was extinct, rushed away to escape the black sow, who would take the hindmost. The bonfire represented the sun, and was intended to strengthen it. But representing the sun, it had all the sun's force, hence those who jumped through it were strengthened and purified. The Welsh reference to the hindmost and to the black sow may point to a form of human sacrifice, perhaps of anyone who stumbled in jumping through the fire. Keating speaks of a druidic sacrifice in the bonfire, whether of a man or a beast is not specified. Probably the victim, like the scapegoat, was laden with the accumulated evils of the year, as in similar New Year customs elsewhere. Later belief regarded the sacrifice, if sacrifice there was, as offered to the powers of evil, the black sow, unless this animal is a reminiscence of the corn spirit in its harmful aspect. Earlier powers, whether growth or a blight, came to be associated with Samhain as demoniac beings, the malignant bird flocks which blighted crops and killed animals, the Saoinach which steal children, and Mongfin the Banshee, to whom women and the rabble make petitions on Samhain Eve. Witches, evil-intentioned fairies and the dead were particularly active then. Though the sacrificial victim had come to be regarded as an offering to the powers of blight, he may once have represented a divinity of growth, or in earlier times the corn spirit. Such a victim was slain at harvest. The harvest is often late in northern Celtic regions, while the slaying was sometimes connected not with the harvest field, but with the later threshing. This would bring it near the Samhain festival. The slaying of the corn spirit was derived from the earlier slaying of a tree or vegetation spirit, embodied in a tree, and also in a human or animal victim. The corn spirit was embodied in the last sheaf cut, as well as in an animal or human being. This human victim may have been regarded as a king, since in late popular custom a mock king is chosen at winter festivals. In other cases, the effigy of a saint is also hung up and carried around the different houses, part of the dress being left at each. The saint has probably succeeded to the traditional ritual of the divine victim. The primitive period in which a corn spirit was regarded as female, with the woman as her human representative, is also recalled in folk custom. The last sheaf is called the maiden, or the mother, while as in Northamptonshire, girls chose a queen on St. Catherine's Day, November the 26th, and in some Christian pageants, Yule's wife, as well as Yule, is present, corresponding to the May Queen of the summer festival. Men also masqueraded as women at the calends. The dates of these survivals may be explained by that dislocation of the Samhain festival already pointed out. This view of the Samhain human sacrifices is supported by the Irish offerings to the Fomorians, gods of growth, later regarded as gods of blight, and to Crom Cruach, in both cases at Samhain. With the evolution of religious thought, the slain victim came to be regarded as an offering to evil powers. This aspect of Samhain, as a festival to promote and assist festivity, is further seen in the belief of the increased activity of fairies at that time. In Ireland, fairies are connected with the Tuatha Dé Danann, the divinities of growth, and in many folk tales they are associated with agricultural processes. The use of evergreens at Christmas is perhaps also connected with the carrying of them around the fields in older times, as an evidence that the life of nature was not extinct. Samhain may thus be regarded as, in origin, an old pastoral and agricultural festival, which in time came to be looked upon as affording assistance to the powers of growth in their conflict with the powers of blight. Perhaps some myth describing this combat may lurk behind the story of the Battle of Mag-tured, fought on Samhain between the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fomorians. While the powers of blight are triumphant in winter, the Tuatha Dé are represented as the victors, though they suffer loss and defeat. Perhaps this enshrines the belief in the continual triumph of life and growth over blight and decay, or it may arise from the fact that Samhain was both a time of rejoicing for the ingathered harvest and of wailing for the coming supremacy of winter and the reign of the powers of blight. Beltane. In Cormac's glossary and other texts, Beltane is derived from Beltane, a goodly fire, or from Beldine, because newly born Deen cattle, were offered to Bel, an idol god. The latter is followed by those who believe in a Celtic Belus, connected with Baal. No such god is known, however, and the god Belenos is in no way connected with the Semitic divinity. Monsieur Darbois assumes an unknown god of death, Beltane, from belo-te, to die, whose festival Beltane was. But Beltane was a festival of life, of the sun shining in his strength. Dr. Stokes gives a more acceptable explanation of the word. Its primitive form was belo-tania, from belos, clear, shining, the root of the names Belenos and Belisama, and tenos, fire. Thus the word would mean something like bright fire, perhaps the sun or the bonfire, or both. The folk survivals of the Beltane and Midsummer festivals show that both were intended to promote fertility. One of the chief ritual acts at Beltane was the kindling of bonfires, often on hills. The house fires in the district were often extinguished, the bonfire being lit by friction from a rotating wheel, the German need fire. The fire kept off disease and evil, hence cattle were driven through it, or according to Cormac, between two fires lit by druids in order to keep them in health during the year. Sometimes the fire was lit beneath a sacred tree, or a pole covered with greenery and surrounded by the fuel, or a tree was burned in the fire. These trees survive in the maypole of later custom, and they represent the vegetation spirit, to whom also the worshippers assimilated themselves by dressing in leaves. They danced sunwise around the fire, or ran through the fields with blazing branches or wisps of straw, imitating the course of the sun, and thus benefiting the fields. For the same reason, the tree itself was probably borne through the fields. Houses were decked with boughs, and thus protected by the spirit of vegetation. An animal representing the spirit of vegetation may have been slain. In late survivals of Beltane at Dublin, a horse's skull and bones were thrown into the fire, the attenuated form of an earlier sacrifice or slaying of a divine victim, by whom strength was transferred to all the animals which passed through the fire. In some cases a human victim may have been slain. This is suggested by customs surviving in Perthshire in the 18th century, when a cake was broken up and distributed, and the person who received a certain blackened portion was called the Beltane Carlin, or devoted. A pretence was made of throwing him into the fire, or he had to leap 3 times through it, and during the festival he was spoken of as dead. Martin says that malefactors were burned in the fire, although he cites no authority, and this agrees with the Celtic use of criminals as victims. Perhaps the victim was at one time a human representative of the vegetation spirit. Beltane cakes, or bannocks, perhaps made of the grain of the sacred last sheaf from the previous harvest, and therefore sacramental in character, were also used in different ways in folk survivals. They were rolled down a slope, a magical imitative act, symbolising and aiding the course of the sun. The cake also had a divinatory character. If it broke on reaching the foot of the slope, this indicated the approaching death of its owner. In another custom in Perthshire, part of the cake was thrown over the shoulder with the words, "This I give to thee, preserve thou my horses, this to thee, preserve thou my sheep, this to thee, O fox, preserve thou my lambs, this to thee, O hooded crow, this to thee, O eagle." Here there is an appeal to the beneficial and noxious powers, whether this was the original intention of the rite. But if the cakes were made of the last sheaf, they were probably at one time eaten sacramentally, their sacrificial use emerging later. The bonfire was a sun charm, representing and assisting the sun. Rain charms were also used at Beltane. Sacred wells were visited, and the ceremony performed with their waters, these perhaps being sprinkled over the tree or the fields to promote a copious rainfall for the benefit of vegetation. The use of such rites at Beltane and at other festivals may have given rise to the belief that wells were especially efficacious then for the purposes of healing. The custom of rolling in the grass to benefit by Maydew was probably connected with magical rites in which moisture played an important part. The idea that the powers of growth had successfully combated those of blight may have been ritually represented. This is suggested by the mimic combats of summer and winter at this time, to which reference has already been made. Again, The May King and Queen represent earlier personages who were regarded as embodying the spirits of vegetation and fertility at this festival, and whose marriage or union magically assisted growth and fertility, as in numerous examples of this ritual marriage elsewhere. It may be assumed that a considerable amount of sexual license also took place with the same magical purpose. Sacred marriage and festival orgy were an appeal to the forces of nature to complete their beneficial work, as well as a magical aid to them in that work. Analogy leads to the supposition that the King of the May was originally a priest-king, the incarnation of the spirit of vegetation. He, or his surrogate, was slain, while his bodily force was unabated, in order that it might be passed on undiminished to his successor. But the persistent place given to the May Queen rather than to the King suggests the earlier prominence of women and of female spirits of fertility, or of a great mother goddess in such rites. It is also significant that in the Perthshire ritual the man chosen was still called the Beltane Carlane, or Cailleach, old woman. And if, as Professor Pearson maintains, witch orgies are survivals of the old sex festivals, then the popular beliefs of the activity of witches on Beltane Eve also shows that the festival had once been mainly one in which women took part. Such orgies often took place on hills which have been the sites of the cult in former times. Midsummer. The ritual of the Midsummer Festival did not materially differ from that of Beltane, and as folk survivals show, it was practised not only by the Celts, but by many other European peoples. It was, in fact, a primitive nature festival such as readily be observed under all similar psychic conditions and in like surroundings. A bonfire was again the central rite of the festival, the communal nature of which is seen in the fact that all must contribute materials to it. In local survivals, mayor and priest, representing the earlier local chief and priest, were present, while a service in church preceded the procession to the scene of the bonfire. Dancing sunwise around the fire to the accompaniment of songs, which probably took the place of hymns or tunes in honour of the sun god, commonly occurred, and by imitating the sun's action may have been intended to make it more powerful. The livelier the dance, the better will be the harvest. As the fire represented the sun, it possessed the purifying and invigorating powers of the sun. Hence, leaping through the fire preserved from disease, brought prosperity, or removed barrenness. Hence also cattle were driven through the fire. But if anyone stumbled as he leapt, ill luck was supposed to follow him. He was devoted to the fadets, or spirits, and perhaps, like the devoted Beltane victim, he may formerly have been sacrificed. Animal sacrifices are certainly found in many survivals, the victim being often placed inside osier baskets and thrown into the fire. In other districts, great human effigies of osier were carried in procession and burned. The connection of such sacrifices with the periodical slaying of a representative of the vegetation spirit has been maintained by Mannhardt and Dr. Fraser. As has been seen, the periodic sacrifices for the fertility of the land are mentioned by Caesar, Strabo, and Diodorus, human victims and animals being enclosed in an osier image and burned. These images survive in the osier effigies just referred to, while they may also be connected with the custom of decking the human representatives of the spirit of vegetation in greenery. The Holocaust may be regarded as extensions of an earlier custom of slaying one victim, the incarnation of a vegetation spirit. This slaying was gradually regarded as sacrificial, but as the beneficial effect of the sacrifice on growth was still believed in, it would naturally be thought that still better effects would be produced if many victims were offered. The victims were burned in a fire representing the sun, and vegetation was thus doubly benefited, by the victims and by the sun god. The oldest conception of the vegetation spirit was that of a tree spirit which had power over rain, sunshine, and every species of fruitfulness. For this reason, a tree had a prominent place both in Beltane and midsummer feasts. It was carried in procession, imparting its benefits to each house or field. Branches of it were attached to each house for the same purpose. It was then burned, or it was set up to procure benefits to vegetation during the year and burned at the next midsummer festival. The sacred tree was probably an oak, and, as has been seen, the mistletoe rite probably took place on Midsummer Eve, as a preliminary to cutting down the sacred tree in order to secure the life or soul of the tree, which must first be secured before the tree could be cut down. The life of the tree was in the mistletoe, still alive in winter when the tree itself seemed to be dead. Such beliefs as this concerning the detachable soul or life survive in Märchen, and are still alive among savages. Folk survivals show that a human or an animal representative of the vegetation spirit, brought into connection with the tree, was also slain or burned along with the tree. Thus, cutting of the mistletoe will be regarded as a preliminary to the slaying of the human victim, who, like the tree, was the representative of the spirit of vegetation. The bonfire representing the sun, and the victims, like the tree, representing the spirit of vegetation, it is obvious why the fire had healing and fertilizing powers, and why its ashes, and the ashes or the flesh of the victims, possessed those same powers. Brands from the fire were carried through the fields or villages, as the tree had been, or placed in the fields or in houses, where they were carefully preserved for a year. All this aided growth and prosperity, just as the smoke of the fire drifting over the fields produced fertility. Ashes from the fire, and probably the calcined bones or even the flesh of the victims, were scattered on the fields or preserved and mixed with the seed corn. Again, part of the flesh may have been eaten sacramentally, since, as we have seen, Pliny refers to the belief of the Celts in eating of human flesh as most wholesome. In the Stone Age, as with many savages, a circle typified the sun, and as soon as the wheel was invented, its rolling motion at once suggested that of the sun. In the Edda, the sun is the beautiful, the shining wheel, and similar expressions occur in the Vedas. Among the Celts, the wheel of the sun was a favourite piece of symbolism, and this is seen in various customs at the midsummer festival. A burning wheel was rolled down a slope or trundled through the fields, or burning brands were whirled around so as to give the impression of a fiery wheel. The intention was primarily to imitate the course of the sun through the heavens, and so, on the principle of imitative magic, to strengthen it. But also, as the wheel was rolled through the fields, so it was hoped that the direct beneficial action of the sun upon them would follow. Similar rites might be performed not only at midsummer but at other times to procure blessing or to ward off evil, e.g. carrying fire around houses or fields of cattle, or round a child deicil or sunwise, and by a further extension of thought, the blazing wheel, or the remains of the burning brands thrown to the winds, had also the effect of carrying off accumulated evils. Beltane and midsummer thus appear as twin halves of a spring or early summer festival, the intention of which was to promote fertility and health. This was done by slaying the spirit of vegetation in his representative, tree, animal, or man. His death quickened the energies of earth and man. The fire also magically assisted the course of the sun. Survival of the ancient rites are, or were, recently found in all Celtic regions, and have been constantly combated by the Church. But though they were continued, their true meaning was forgotten, and they were mainly performed for luck or out of sheer conservatism. Sometimes a Christian aspect was given to them, e.g. by connecting the fires with St. John, or by associating the rites with the service of the Church, or by the clergy being present at them. But their true nature was still evident as acts of pagan worship and magic, which no veneer of Christianity could ever quite conceal. Lugnasadh. The 1st of August, coming midway between Beltane and Samhain, was an important festival among the Celts. In Christian times the day became Lammas, but its name still survives in Irish as Lugnasadh, in Gaelic as Lugnasadh or Lugnasadh, and in Manx as Lor Lunis, and it is still observed as a fair or feast in many districts. Former assemblies at convenient centres were held on this day, not only for religious purposes but for commerce and pleasure, both of these being of course saturated with religion. All Ireland met at Telchi, just as all Gaul met at Lugdunum, Lug's town, or Lyon in honour of Augustus, though the feast there had formerly been in honour of the god Lugus. The festival was here Romanised, as it was also in Britain, where its name appears as Goel-aoust, Gul-austus, and Gul-aoust, now the August feast, but formerly the Feel of Augustus, the name having been replaced one corresponding to Lugnasadh. Cormac explains the name Lugnasadh as a festival of Lugnasadh, celebrated by him at the beginning of autumn, and the Rennes Dindsenchas accounts for its origin by saying that Lug's foster mother, Telchu, having died on the calends of August, he directed an assembly for the lamentation to be held annually on that day at her tomb. Lug is thus the founder of his own festival. For that it was his, and not Telchu's, is clear from the fact that his name is attached to it. As Lammas was a Christian harvest thanksgiving, so also was Lugnasadh, a pagan harvest feast, part of the ritual which passed over to Samhain. The people made glad before the sun god, Lug having perhaps that character, who had assisted them in the growth of things on which their lives depended. Marriages were also arranged at this feast, probably because men now had more leisure and more means for entering upon matrimony. Possibly promiscuous love-making also occurred as a result of the festival gladness, agricultural districts being still notoriously immoral. Some evidence points to the connection of the feast with Lug's marriage, though this has been allegorized into his wedding the sovereignty of Erin. Perhaps we have here a hint of the rite of the sacred marriage, for the purpose of magically fertilizing the fields against next year's sowing. Due observance of the feast produced abundance of corn, fruit, milk and fish. Probably the ritual observed included the preservation of the last sheaf as representing the corn spirit, giving some of it to the cattle to strengthen them, and mingling it with next year's corn to impart it to the power of the corn spirit. It may also have included the slaying of an animal or human incarnation of the corn spirit, whose flesh and blood quickened the soil, and so produced abundance next year, or when partaken of by the worshippers brought blessings to them. To neglect such rites, abundant instances of which exist in folk custom, would be held to result in scarcity. This would also explain, as already suggested, why the festival was associated with the death of Telchu, or of Carmen. The euhemerized queen goddess Telchu and the woman Carmen had once been corn goddesses, evolved from more primitive corn spirits and slain at the feast of the female representatives. The story of their death and burial at the festival was a dim memory of this ancient rite, and since the festival was also connected with the sun god Lug, it's easy to bring him into the relationship with the earlier goddess. Elsewhere, the festival, in its memorial aspect, was associated with a king, possibly because male victims had come to be representatives of a corn god, who had taken the place of the goddess. Some of the ritual of these festivals is illustrated by scattered notices in classical writers, and on the whole, they support our theory that the festivals originated in a female cult of spirits or goddesses of fertility. Strabo speaks of sacrifices offered to Demeter and to Kore, according to the ritual followed at Samothrace, in an island near Britain, i.e. to native goddesses equated with them. He also describes the ritual of the Namnite women on an island of the Loire. They are called Bacchantes, because they conciliated Bacchus with mysteries and sacrifices. In other words, they observed an orgiastic cult of a god equated with Bacchus. No man must set foot on the island, but the women left it once a year for intercourse with the other sex. Once a year, the temple of the god was unroofed, and roofed again before sunset. If any woman dropped her load of materials, and it was said this always happened, she was torn in pieces and her limbs were carried around the temple. Dionysius Periegetes says the women were crowned with ivy, and celebrated their mysteries by night in honour of Earth and Proserpine with great clamour. Pliny also makes a reference to British rites, in which nude women and girls took part, their bodies stained with woad. At a later time, St. Gregory of Tours speaks of the image of the goddess Berecynthia drawn on a litter through the streets, fields and vineyards of Augustodenum on the days of her festival, or when the fields were threatened with scarcity. The people danced and sang before it. The image was covered with a white veil. Berecynthia has been conjectured by Professor Anwyl to be the goddess Brigindu, worshipped at Valnay. These rites were all directed towards divinities of fertility. But in harvest customs in Celtic Scotland and elsewhere, 2 sheaves of corn were called respectively the Old Woman and the Maiden, the corn spirit of the past year and that of the year to come, and corresponding to Demeter and Kore in early Greek agricultural ritual. As in Greece, so among the Celts, the primitive corn spirits had become more individualized goddesses with an elaborate cult, observed on an island or at other sacred spots. The cult probably varied here and there, and that of a god of fertility may have taken the place of the cult of goddesses. A god was worshipped by the Namnite women, according to Strabo, goddesses according to Dionysius. The mangled victim was probably regarded as a representative of a divinity, and perhaps part of the flesh was mixed with the seed corn, like the grain of the maiden sheaf, or buried in the earth. This rite is common among savages, and its presence in old European ritual is attested by survivals. That these rites were taboo to men probably points to the fact that they were examples of an older general custom, in which all such rites were in the hands of women who cultivated the earth, and who were the natural priestesses of goddesses of growth and fertility, of vegetation and the growing corn. Another example is found in the legend and the procession at Godiva at Coventry, the survival of a pagan cult from which men were excluded. Pliny speaks of the nudity of the women engaged in the cult. Nudity is an essential part of all primitive agricultural rites, and painting the body is also a widespread ritual act. Dressing with leaves or green stuff, as among the Namnite women, often with the intention of personating the spirits of vegetation, is also customary. By unveiling the body, and especially the sexual organs, women more effectually represented the goddess of fertility, and more effectually, as her representatives, or through their own powers, magically conveyed fertility on the fields. Nakedness thus became a powerful magico-religious symbol, and it's found as part of the ritual for producing rain. There is thus abundant evidence of the cult of fertility, vegetation and corn spirits who tended to become divinities, male or female. Here and there, through conservatism, the cult remained in the hands of women, but more generally it had become a ritual in which both men and women took part, that of the great agricultural festivals, where a divinity had taken the place of the Vega spirit. Her image, like that of Berecynthia, was used in the ritual, but the image was probably the successor of the tree which embodied the vegetation spirit and was carried through the fields to fertilize them. Similar processions of images, often accompanied by the ritual washing of the image in order to invigorate the divinity, or as in the similar May Day custom to produce rain, are found in the Teutonic cult of Nerthus, the Phrygian of Cybele, the Hindu of Bhavani, and the Roman ritual of the Bona Dea. The image of Berecynthia was thus probably washed also. Washing the images of saints, usually to produce rain, has sometimes taken the place of the washing of a divine image, and similarly the relics of saints are carried through the field, as was the tree or image. The community at Iona perambulated a newly sown field with St. Columba's relics in time of drought, and shook his tunic 3 times in the air, and were rewarded by a plentiful rain, and later by a bountiful harvest. Many of these local cults were pre-Celtic, but we need not therefore suppose that the Celts, or the Aryans as a whole, had no such cults. The Aryans everywhere adopted local cults, but this they would not have done if, as they supposed, they had themselves outgrown them. The cults were local, but the Celts had similar local cults, and easily accepted those of the people that they conquered. We cannot explain the persistence of such primitive cults as lie behind the great Celtic festivals, both in classical times and over the whole area of Europe among the peasantry, by referring to them solely to a pre-Aryan folk. They were as much Aryan as pre-Aryan. They belonged to those unchanging strata of religion which have so largely supplied the soil in which its later and more spiritual growths have flourished. And among these they still emerge, unchanged and unchanging, like the gaunt outcrops of some ancient rock formation, amid rich vegetation and fragrant flowers.
And that was Chapter 19 of For the Religion of the Ancient Celts by J.A. MacCulloch. You'll find the show notes at celtictomes.libsyn.com. That's LIBSYN.com.
We'd like to say a massive thank you and give a shout out to Daniel, Selene, Erica, Kyle and Brandy for being patrons of the podcast on our Patreon page. Thank you so much. Your support is ensuring that we can keep on making these shows. If you'd like to support our continued work on Celtic Tomes, please come and find us on patreon.com/Celtic Tomes. That's patreon.com/Celtic Tomes.
You've been listening to Celtic Tomes, read by Gary and Ruth. Our theme music is Gander in the Pretty Hole by Slauncher, and a link to their music can be found in the show notes at celtictomes.libsyn.com. This podcast has been produced by The Celtic Myth Show.